if you're teaching online, standard methods of sourcing, choosing good sources, is it helped by requiring students who are online to investigate, to interrogate those sources so that they're aware of the process in getting and choosing better sources? So a little bit of a background. So this is related to a fellowship that I completed from 2019 to 2020 at the Maricopa Institute for Learning regarding effective ways of sourcing. So first of all, I had to start with a literature review. And as you can see, even before the term fake news was common, there were plenty of concerns about choice of sources and what they represented, as well as critical thinking and its application towards that. So historically, in a literature review, media and digital literacy is where a source quality was evaluated under those banners, and there are three major stages. The first stage is authoritative, which has to do with categories or labels of the medium in which the content is released. And it has to do with things such as rules of thumbs, like a journal is considered more reliable than a blog. And early on, those were very workable ways, and is still taught in some higher education that way, by categories. Things are better than websites, journals are better than blogs, books are good, things of that nature. The second stage is authoritative and reflective. So you keep the categories, and there's a hierarchy of categories, but you also have students reflect on the message. You can use assignments, you can use rubrics in order to test the quality of a source, as well as the traditional labels. And it's all good, but things change with modern take on things. Which brings us to the third stage, where you're expected, or at least in an ideal situation, you interrogate each source before you use it as sourcing for your arguments. Think of it as background checking the source or researching the research. What does that mean? Again, that means checking the source. Where is it from? What is the agenda behind it? Who paid to print it? Is it coming from a website by an organization that has a very clear and obvious agenda? And it has to do with the post-trust ecosystem of postmodern times. And with media, especially electronic media, this becomes a bigger issue. So how does the study fit within all this? Well, face-to-face students have traditionally had library critical thinking, as well as sourcing and source credibility lessons taught in the library, as well as in their composition research classes. However, if you switch to online, does the library support change? It tends to. Does not having face-to-face engagement and the nature of online teaching, does that change how much effort a student puts into choosing a source? It does. Now, with this activity, interrogating sources, forcing them to do more work before allowed to use for citation and sourcing in an assignment, would this activity have a transfer value beyond academic use? That's kind of what the question is about. So there's plenty of existing materials going back quite a bit about choosing good sources. Just as an example of the post-trust source ecosystem, we have the Council of Europe and their information disorder topic, and they have ways of looking at sources beyond just labels. So what does that mean? Well, you can look at it for the agent, the message, the interpreter, the roles that people have, and the role of message. But you also, in most modern systems of evaluating sources, look at the aspects of that source, the medium of it, who created it, why did they create it, what's the production part, is it well edited, is it slapdash in creation, and you also look at distribution, how is it distributed, and those are factors that are well documented as things to consider in sourcing. So going straight to the assignment and the study that I conducted based on that, what we're talking about is the active interrogation of sources. And again, background checking a source. So what I'm doing is making students do a bit more work before they can just quote and cite as support for an argument. Basically looking at credibility fingerprints, discipline agnostic. So it's not about being a specialist in biology and being able to evaluate a source as good or not because of its inherent content in there. It's about looking at beyond demonstrated labels, but looking at credibility as a dynamic evaluation that's communicated and can be recorded, that can be requested, and can be evaluated. How does that affect the e-learning student? Well, to stereotype a little bit, but not really to stereotype, what we're looking at with online learning is there's less, no, or a different role for library reinforcement, the traditional medium for media literacy and critical literacy of sources. Online, you also have a lot more search engine vetting. What's the first source found? Using Google as a way to vet a source, or even using Google Scholar. That doesn't necessarily produce anything but an authoritative label for evaluation. And also, online students are behaviorally different, and there's a great citation there. What does that mean? Well, they tend to do things faster and run at the speed of the internet, which can be an issue when you're talking about choosing your sources carefully and looking at them and researching. So this is a glimpse of the actual assignment that I've used in face-to-face classes for a long time and have now switched to using them on online, and I'm looking to see if they're effective. So it's basically a table, a credibility scoring table that breaks into 4 sections. So any source, before you can use it, has to be evaluated by 4 criteria: author, the style of the source presentation, the source content and meta information about it, and then online or medium related questions about it. So in every English 102 online, and specific for the study, I use this table, which gives students a range, a trust, distrust category range to evaluate, and instructions on how to do that. And for every source they need to use as a minimum for their papers, for their research papers, regardless of topic, they have to evaluate that source. And that starts with a score of 0 and moves up with trust criteria met, moves down with distrust criteria met. So looking at this instrument, which has been used before, what about it? Well, it requires actively doing that research. You cannot just use a source. You cannot just go to JSTOR or a journal database and use it. You got to look at it, even if it's highly qualified, but especially if it's a blog, a website, or something else. You're going to score it against those credibility questions in 4 categories. Okay? You're going to have a cutoff credibility score. And again, the example of a credit score, things are good if it's high credit, things are bad if it's low credit, is a great metaphor for understanding credibility. And it plays on that metaphor. And I want students to also reflect on the awareness that the fake news is an ecosystem of relationships, markers, problems, both with their topic, with the source, and the current times. So credibility is in flux. Communication challenges and communication choices. So communication choices, again, I'm looking for students to not just rate that score, but to place it in the context of thinking and interpretation. They have their own bias spectrum. So would a fellow student take those questions and rate them the same way? Maybe, maybe not, probably not. Does the teacher rate that source in the same way, trust, distrust? Again, they're choosing from a range of trust and distrust to create a cred score. Is that different, and what does that mean? This is an example sheet, a credibility scoring sheet that gets attached, in this case page 15 and 16, and shows 6 sources evaluated. As you can see, there are pluses and minuses based on how the student chose to answer the question. And it goes through these categories. And if it doesn't meet a criteria, let's say 8 points, you can't use the source. So again, it creates a unnatural but needed reflection on the source. So does it work? Does it work online? Is it considered worth the student's time? Because that's part of the communication challenge through this study. Does it create awareness of the ecosystem of communication, that disinformation and accuracy are not instant, black and white? Does it showcase credibility as measurables, because you are graded based on using good sources and you are graded less for using bad sources, or you lose points? But it's also more than that. You want them to understand that it's a fluid relationship between several factors. So credibility of a source, which is essential for overcoming fake news, is a fluid relationship between several factors. The medium, the source, what is the source, where is it from, The message, what does the wording reveal about it? What does it focus on? What gets left out? What's the context, the times, the social weight of the topic, the use? Is it used for an academic paper? Does it have a use outside? Is it a life or death decision? And the reader completes the text, that the reader themselves brings in a bias. Actively examining those relationships take time, and as an assignment, it takes time. Will an online student do this assignment correctly before using their paper, or will they rush it? Will they make up numbers and just try to get a grade? And then finally, the aspect of contagion and spread. So how is news spread, fake news? So looking at the study at a glance, again, more opinions together does not make it better, but that's a common fallacy or a common issue with especially online sources. And clean information, what does that mean? Metaphors for understanding. Well, the actual study centered on, an IRB study centered on having surveys, 4 surveys at different points. First, kind of like a pretest, what are their basic understandings of what makes a source good, what makes it reliable, what doesn't. Questions about what is fake news. Then after kind of a standard library driven credibility lesson, how do they see a source? What is a good source? What is a bad source? What is a credible source? Then after completing the lesson, which is what the point of the assignment was, how do they feel about things? And then finally, how do they apply that to the actual choice of sources used for argumentative paper? And do they feel that it made a better paper? And does the value of kind of doing that background check on whether something is real or not, or source it, is vital. So just a basic set of results. So, and then I'll show you a little bit about methodology. So yes, active interrogation of sources did have a self-recognized transfer beyond academia. Through these surveys, there was a sense from the students that there is value in checking the source before using it, rather than just looking at it from labels. Did it come from a type of source that I trust or not? But if you do the work, if you background check a source, there was value, and it does transfer beyond academia. It redefines fake news. So it wasn't just fake news means it doesn't have supporting evidence. You can have news, you can have information that's not reliable that appears in reliable form. Things like retraction watch, issues that concern even vetted types of sources. Did it improve source choice and by consequence quality of quotes used in the papers? It did, and I'll show you that in a second. Is there value or a role beyond the course? We just talked about that, particularly in politics, health, journalism, and kind of work path. There was a value seen. Now, it wasn't all perfect and roses. The time that it took to check these sources before using them took its toll. It made the exercise not as valuable, or just as valuable as the quicker, here's a category, just use journals, they're pre-vetted, they're peer-reviewed, and reflect on them. So there wasn't a humongous leap of faith that individually checking sources was worth the time investment. Supported incoming existing hierarchy of authority category labels, fancy for it's peer-reviewed. Chances are it's better than a local newspaper or a Facebook posting. So it supported that. Worthwhile value of personal active research confirmed that there's a citizen's role in that. So there's a sense that it's a participation that matters in decisions bigger than academics. And another exception was only a few students really pondered about their own bias or the teacher's bias. So they've got a checklist or a table, they're scoring, coming up with a score. Most presumed that that score would be the same by anyone, and not a range. So it wasn't a fuzzy range. And that was a bit of a miss, something that I was hoping that would get covered. So a little bit about the actual study, and coming in to English 102, typically a second semester freshman. Interestingly enough, and it was a reasonably interesting assessment, though it's a small sample group, most learned their value of what's a good source or not a good source to use in high school. So they weren't getting that in the English 101 or first semester experience as much as what remained from what they learned in high school. Looking at kind of rating categories of sources, just before anything, just coming into the class, the three sources that they thought were the weakest were personal website, a movie as a source, and a blog. The three they thought were the best sources or the most vetted or most reliable were an encyclopedia, a book, and a library database. Now, after the course is pretty much done, as you can see by this word cloud, there's a lot of focus on review, on evidence, credible, making sure that a source has been vetted and actively so, that it's vetted for the moment by the individual with an investment by the individual. A look at the post-test, the sources that were not considered highly credible were pretty much the same. The numbers moved a little bit, but website, movie, blog, less reliable. Book was still very reliable, but the number one spot was now journal. The peer-reviewed process, which is kind of what they were doing. They were reviewing their sources and giving it a background check, was considered better. And library databases continue to be the number one reliable. Just a little bit of a look on opinion and how they believe that source choice was influenced by this lesson. Again, a lot of word association with credibility, credible, good, if they did the work, if they checked the source and it passed numbers. Now, the reward part, the measurable. So yes, we're communicating that it's inherent bias and people will rate things differently, just like a real credit score. But was there an improvement that showed in their assessment, in grades? And there was. As you can see from the study semester of fall 2019, definitely greater grades than previous semesters that only relied on kind of the canned instruments used, originally vetted by library science, but used in the courses. You also find that we tried for spring 2020, COVID thing kind of skewed it, so we couldn't finish those lessons. So that data unfortunately was not usable. Did it break what was hoped to be found statistically? Maybe, but for the fall of study time, it did work. So that kind of shows you, and again, I'm not going into a lot of methodology because I'm rushing things, that if you require students to actively vet, to Google, to Amazon check reviews, to background check the author, to check them out on LinkedIn, check out what their specialties are, what a publisher's specialties are. If we have some students checking their sources for, was it written 5 years ago, 3 years ago, 2 years ago, who paid for the research? If we have students vet a source actively by researching it, they not only get better sources overall, which they were doing anyway with the existing library assignments, but the added bonus is there is some transfer value, some feeling that if you do the work and check your sources, you are going to do better outside of academia, better especially in the fields of journalism, being able to tell what to believe and what not to believe, health, work, and politics. So that's my presentation.